Hi, it's Matthew Holt with the THCB Spotlight. I'm here with Megan Coda. Megan is the Executive Director of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, and we're here to talk about this thing called digital therapeutics, as to what they are, what the Alliance does, and whether they really exist and how we should treat them. Megan, thanks for coming on. I know we've done a little bit of sparring online and in person, but we've actually never interviewed each other. I've never interviewed you, so I'm looking forward to this. So how are you doing?
Good. It's more fun to spar in person, but I miss the in-person aspect.
Yeah,
So
I mean, we're
again.
all hoping to get back to that pretty soon, but no, man, they're about. I'm in my 50s, and they're not so far away in California from giving us old people the shots, and then we'll not quite see old people, and then hopefully we'll be back to normal at some point. Anyway, for those people who don't know, just tell people what the Digital Therapeutics Alliance is, and then we'll dive into a bit about what digital therapeutics are. But tell us about the organization that you had.
Sounds good. So about 3.5 or so years ago, we created an association really to come together to talk about what even are digital therapeutics, to the point you're asking. What are some of the ways that we can define this industry, start to distinguish it from other types of digital technologies out there? How can we encourage quality across all the different types of products out here and really bring people together from across the world to really talk about what this is and how we can do this better, really with that focal point though of how do we serve patients, clinicians, payers, and regulatory agencies as they start to embark on this pathway. So that has really been our mission from the start and continues to be.
Okay, so who are the companies? So you're the head. You're kind of an organization. It's on the way to being a typical lobbying group, but you had to sort of set up more and identify the industry and do a bit more work than that. And we'll talk a bit about some of that work you've done. But tell me some of the companies who are involved in the, who are your members?
All right, so on our board, for example, we have Achille, we have WellDoc, we have Valentis, we have Duke Clinical Research Institutes right now, Big Health, Freespira. So we have a lot of those types of companies that are really the innovators and the leaders in this industry. We then also have a number of pharmaceutical life science companies that are really building into this space, in addition to a couple of technology companies, a few academic centers. So it's really been cool to see a good cross-representation of the industry. More or less, we have 40 some companies across 15 countries. So I love the international component of what we're doing.
All right. Well, we all have that good international travel. I think we met in Berlin, and it was a lot of fun.
I know.
We'll get back there soon. So you've also been involved not just in the sort of lobbying and setting up side, but you guys have done about a bunch of work with the Digital Medicine Society and I believe Health Excel in kind of doing some definitions. And speaking as a guy who's been defining, Health 2.0, and you probably don't remember, but I defined, I had a thing called unplatforms, then we had a thing called the health interface layer and the digital data utility layer, and then we started, Indu was defining Health 2.0 in 5 different ways. So I'm all about the definitions and what's right and what's wrong, and then whether digital health is a real definition, and there was mHealth and God knows what else. But you came up with a sort of combination of digital health, digital medicine, and digital therapeutics. Real quick, can you just run over what the difference is between those three things?
So I think to some of the points I think you're going to be making eventually, I think the definitions will continue to evolve. So all that to say, we really wanted to at least start off on this notion of let's just start to create some of the parameters that we believe exist in the industry. So digital health, everything, basically from everything from enterprise support to clinician support to patient wellness and so forth. Under and within digital health sits digital medicine, and really DIME has been really helping lead that off.
That's the Digital Medicine Society. Sorry, DIME. Yep. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. And then, so that is more of those products that are measuring and intervening, and digital therapeutics are the subset of digital medicine that intervenes. So it really is just a way to help people understand what we're talking about and where we all fit. There's a number of other characterizations that will, I'm sure, be created, but that was just our first attempt to really start to say, if digital health is everything, digital medicine are those that require clinical evidence and some degree of regulatory oversight as appropriate to the claim and indication. And then digital therapeutics really are that more narrow subset that really fits within the digital medicine space.
Okay, so let's unpack a little bit what people are calling digital therapeutics. Now, the other thing is that not everyone who has a digital therapeutic, quote unquote, is quite applying to your definition. Not everyone's necessarily a member, but you're seeing a lot of people who talk about this. And in fact, going way back to Sean Duffy from Amada started writing about this in 2014. They're, I think, a product which you might call digital medicine or even digital health, which you originally started calling it a digital therapeutic, but really a lot of what was going on in, say, the diabetes prevention space, or maybe in the maybe in the mental health space, are essentially taking what's been long-term practices that were done and delivered, either by a book or by a community or by some direct instruction or whatever, and basically creating a digital format of those. And you could argue that's what Amada did with DPP, and you can argue a lot of what's going on in the CBT world in mental health is in that bucket. Then, I'd stretch as to whether that's a therapeutic, because you tend to think of a therapeutic as something that's regulated by the FDA because it has the potential to harm people, right? The idea of why the FDA is there is obviously for safety and to some extent for effectiveness, and potentially one day maybe, or if you're international, so the Australian FDA equivalent actually does cost effectiveness as well, right? But the question is, there's a distinction, between digital products that are attempting to, if you like, reproduce what happened before, and those that are trying to do a effective actual change of condition. So you mentioned Akili, right? So they have a video game which essentially, standalone, they say, they have data from clinical trials, is the equivalent of taking a medication like Ritalin or something like that. It's an ADHD medication for kids. And essentially, they're saying it does the same thing by, making a intervention, like a physical intervention with the brain, via the video game. There are other people doing this with flashing lights for pain, and we're talking about people doing this in Alzheimer's using different types of ways of people using sound and other types of things. So that category, I would sort of get. I understand you could call that a therapeutic, digital therapeutic. Do you find that you're seeing the distinction between that kind of category and the ones that are kind of more like we are putting together a series of tools that were used before, or maybe more new, but are now kind of more of a general healthcare process? And I'd argue that some of the tools you get from a Pear or a Click Therapeutics might be more like that.
All right. Well, you had a lot in that question to unpack.
I'm trying to get this distinction about what is the bit that's really therapeutic.
Okay. I think let's just stand back. And the way that I've been talking about digital therapeutics, and we at the Alliance and others within the industry, has been looking at the idea that it's software that is generating an intervention, delivering that intervention, and really looking at that intervention for the sake of actually saying, I'm going to prevent, manage, or treat a medical disease or disorder. So I think to the point, one of the points you were making earlier is it actually has to have an impact on a disease state, exactly what you're doing. So as soon as you're using software to actually impact a disease state for a specific patient and specific condition, that's when, in my mind, it goes from that wellness space and into that therapeutic side. So digital therapeutics can work alongside of medications. They can work alongside of different in-person therapies. They can also then work alongside of other different types of platform technologies. And I think some of what you mentioned earlier are now more in that space where you're looking at some monitoring and diagnostic fitting in with the digital therapeutic and alongside of clinician support and other forms of coaching and all of this. So it's more of a suite of products. One aspect of that, though, is a digital therapeutic. And that's the point where we say, now you have to do a clinical trial and submit to regulatory oversight and quality management systems and patient centricity and all of those notions there. So that is really where the area I'm focusing in on. When we're talking about digital therapeutics, so you're bringing up the point, there are a lot of different mechanisms of action. So some will have delivery of CBT, some will have a direct neural activation of the networks, activation of neural networks. Others will have a variety of other aspects too. So I think what we're seeing now is really that evolution of what the mechanism of action is and how they're addressing specific disease states and whether it's the full disease state that they're addressing versus a component of it, or if it's in addition to a medication, how that's working too. So I think we're seeing a lot of evolution already with what has taken place from 2010 and beyond in the digital therapeutic industry. There's been a lot of evolution.
Sure.
There's going to continue to be a lot of evolution. And that is what I'm increasingly excited and intrigued by. Ideas that I never would have thought of myself. We're really seeing that start to come to market and be developed. So I'll pause there. I also gave a long answer to a long question.
No, no,
So
no.
let's see where to go.
It's a very complicated topic, so I'm not expecting to get to immediate clarity, because there are many things that are overlapping. So one of them is is as you said, is the therapeutic doing the equivalent of a molecule or compound. It's making some kind of change to the human body, to the brain, what have you. So that's a big one. And you can argue, of course, that all health care and medical interventions are making some kind. I mean, you read a diet book on a diet, you're making some change to your body.
Nice.
The hope is that using a tool like an Armada or a retrofit or one of those things, you're doing it more effectively and doing it better, or you're doing it better. I wouldn't say that was the same as putting a drug in your body. If you put a drug in your body, if you put a medical compound, a chemical compound in your body, there's obviously a lot of risk of side effects, and that's mostly what the FDA was originally set up to do, right? You got FDA regulation to make sure the thing wouldn't kill you. Going back to the 30s. And then later on, they added this idea of efficacy. So, is it going to be effective, and is the outcome of the drug worth the side effects? Because all the drugs have side effects. You could argue that a lot of the issue around risk is that there's not as much risk with many of these digital interventions, because if you and I agree, there has to be some testing of this. But if we are making you play a video game and it improves your ADHD, I mean, I guess there's a risk of getting more addicted to the video game, or there's a risk it doesn't work. But there's probably not an actual, physical risk like there is in taking a drug. But would you accept that, or am I misstating that?
I won't accept that in all regards, but some, I think there's fairness there. So if you look at those that are responding to patients with insulin, for example, if a digital therapeutic knows what your last dose of insulin was and what your blood glucose is, and then tells you, now take this many units of insulin right now because it's responsive and it's an active response. If it's off by a decimal point, there's significant harm there. So I think there are different levels of risk that are embedded in some of these products. And some of them could actually be very harmful in some regards. Again, I'm a pharmacist by background, so I spent quite a few years counseling and going over the side effects of medication. So I know that intimately well. Digital therapeutics, there are less risk, I think, in general, which is great. There are some, though, and I think some of those could relate to some more of those medication-specific ones or other notions of that nature. But I think you brought up the efficacy point. There's a lot that can be said about digital anything. So let's make sure that it's actually doing what it needs to be doing and it's impacting patients the way it needs to be impacting them. So that's why we're really looking at doing clinical trials, getting them published in a peer-reviewed journal, undergoing regulatory oversight. So all of that to say, I think that efficacy is really important. And that's where entities like notified bodies, FDA, or other entities out there who are really looking at this really come into play for our industry.
So I think there are two things that are crossing here, or maybe three. I don't know if we're in a multi-dimensional space. I guess when I wave my hands around with the background, and they appear and disappear, that may be indicative of it. So one is, and I think, you're referring, one of the first ones that got FDA approval was the well-lock one, where it says, time to eat more glucose because your insulin level is up or down or what have you. And yes, if things go wrong, that can be extremely risky. And this is a line that, the EMR industry tiptoed around, right? So when it's giving you instructions to what to do as a clinician, what to do next, or telling a patient what to do next, there was also the idea that a clinician, a pharmacist, a pharmacist or a doctor a nurse was making a judgment. Mm-hmm. And it was their decision based on the information they were given. But we know half the time people are just sort of, those clinicians are just putting into instructions what they've been told. And so, yes, the EMR industry has always danced around not being FDA regulated, whereas the well-locks of the world went that far and said, okay, we should get regulated because, we are doing something that is directly impacting, the chemical compounds within the human, right? So I give that's one area.
But there's difference between clinical decision support. So using a technology to suggest something to a clinician and that clinician then says, that's interesting. I'm going to use my judgment and make a call on this or that. That's going to be really different though than the software just going directly to the patient and saying, based upon all the factors here, this is exactly what to do and how to do it and what you need to take for next steps. So that's where, to me, that's more of that digital therapeutic versus a clinical decision support notion. And part of the reason why I think FDA and others are engaged in this industry, obviously with risk associated, there's different levels of FDA engagement and oversight. Fully can respect that. But all that to say, I think that's kind of one of those distinctions that I think where we fit as digital therapeutics compared to some other products out there.
So you're saying that I mean, obviously there are times when, and we've all seen examples in Bob Walker's book where decisions get made. So actually, it goes both ways. Sometimes the computer makes a decision, and it's and it ends up with a harmful impact. And in fact, there have been some lawsuits about this, from clinical decision support being used. It's also in the other way, right? Clinical decision support gets overridden by a pharmacist or by a doctor, and and a mistake happens. And in the Digital Doctor, Bob Walker's book, there's a whole thing about where UCSF, the pharmacist, the nurse, everyone, even the patient, all overrode what the computer said, which is don't give this drug, and they gave way too much, and the patient nearly died. And it's well, obviously we have that kind of, but there's that issue, as you said, that who is making a decision. If you put a human clinician in the loop,
there's something to that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's something to that.
No, and I agree. I mean, that line's, I think, a little blurred in your making out, but I accept there's a line there. The other one is like the other one. If you now have one of these tools, and I would say Pear and Click are two of the companies that have been doing this, where they've been aggressively saying, we're going to get this what looks to me more like a standard medical process. It's more like I was a doctor, I gave you a book, you went and read it, and you did what I said. Now, hopefully you do it better. Hopefully it's more effective. Hopefully it's because it's on your phone and coming up regularly, and we're tracking with you as you're doing it. Maybe it's hopefully it's more effective, right? Than just the doctor giving you a book or some instructions and hoping you go and follow this course of treatment, which may or may not involve an actual medication, of course, as well. But I guess my question there is that something, the FDA has sort of reached out and said, well, we're going to regulate the algorithms, we're going to regulate the companies themselves who are doing that more so than the actual individual application, because that software might change over time. We have to figure out a way to let that happen. So I think that's sensible the way the FDA's done it. I'm now saying that I am struggling to see the difference between that and all the rest of the stuff we do in medicine anyway, which now, this is not to say that the rest of the stuff we do in medicine should not have trials, evidence, figure out if it works, if it doesn't work. And we also know that in the absence of, and I've had this fight with the AMA, Jim Madera and others, in the absence of, in the absence of digital health, medicine did a whole lot of, everyday practice, a whole lot of stuff going on which is not evidence-based, which is, which isn't necessarily helpful. And we know we talk about wasting the system, and we know there's a lot of problems going on in medicine anyway. So I think it's a great thing to say that yes, we should have these digital interventions, these digital therapeutics, you want to call them that, analyze, assess, go through clinical rigor, figure out if they work, if they don't work, figure out if we can improve them. That's all great. My question is, does that mean they have to be regulated like a real drug or a medical device which is doing stuff to your body, if it's not inside your body, as it were? If it's not, if it's more like, essentially, I gave you a book, but I digitized it and helped you with coaching, that kind of stuff. Where do you come out on that?
Well, I come out on the side that if you meet the definition of a medical device, you're going to have to fall in line with what a medical device is and the regulation associated with it. I still do think that even if you,
okay, but so be really clear, something like, Reset or the smoking cessation thing that Click came out with, or one of those programs, is that a medical device in your view? I believe those guys are members of your alliance, right?
Well, so looking at some of Pear's products, and I don't want to speak to anyone directly because I do not want to misrepresent anyone, just for fairness to the companies too.
Sure.
But I think all that to say, I think there are some of those that when you, again, are actually impacting the state of the disease. So if you're, curing, treating, mitigating, and a couple of others in there. I should know the definition. Therefore, then, no matter what modality you're using and making that claim, you do need to be subject to either the definition of a drug or medical device. So I think in some of these cases, even though they're using things that have been in an in-person environment and there is a digitizing aspect of it, there's a lot more to it also, I think, in terms of adding different features or functionalities. There are some conditions that probably aren't in that disease state space that we as DTA are going to consider really looking at in terms of what is a disease state. So I think there's some notions where that wellness disease state boundary line is still a little gray. And I'll definitely give you that one. But I think in terms of the fact that you're actually still using software, still going to say, we're going to actually treat an aspect of your depression. We're going to impact an aspect of your substance abuse using software that, yes, relies on things like CBT, but then can add in ideas around contingency management, other forms of patient-reported outcomes, and end user feedback and metrics and outcomes and things of that nature. So I think once you look at what the holistic package is, it probably goes beyond what is just seen as a simple notion of we're just going to digitize a pen and paper environment into this new technology interface.
And I agree. And, you know, I don't know we're in a disagreement. That's not the area we're not disagreeing is whether or not we shouldn't be using these tools with an enhanced, I don't know, ecosystem. Maybe the idea that the doctor, right, would take, sorry?
Is our disagreement around the FDA's engagement then?
I think our disagree. Well, let's just say what I think we agree on. That medicine and health care delivery, it should, and it is, and is slowly and should probably move faster to an area where there is sort of computer-based, phone-based, technology-based, 24/7 support to a patient or a caregiver or family or what have you, delivering a whole range of things. And that might be, you know, human coaching. It might be bot coaching backed up by humans. There's a lot of measurement and diagnostic measurement, you know, that should go on. And we should get to that panoply of, you know, and interventions suggested to the individual patient or to their caregivers or whomever, based on a bunch of rigorous methodology and algorithms about what happens next. And I think, you know, you could argue that whether that involves the coaching, but I mean, the typical thing, right? If you're managing what Eugene Borokovich calls disease management 2.0, right? If you're managing someone's diabetes at home and you get a note that their blood sugar level went up or what have you, whether it's a bot that tells them what to do about it, or whether it's a human coach calling them up, suggesting next steps. I mean, I think that's a great plus and a great advance for how healthcare is doing compared to, you know, a doctor having a 1-point interaction with somebody every 2 months and not really knowing what happens when they go home. So I love that as a thing. My concern, right, is that if you go down the path of saying this is a medical device or this is a drug, this is the same as a drug, it's a digital drug, a digital therapeutic, and we need to get FDA regulation, you're also going down the path of saying this has to, two things. One is this then has to stay within the current medical system, has to be prescribed by a doctor. Whereas the overall medical system, I would hope, is somewhat moving away from that and saying, what are the set of services that we could deliver to you? And the second, respond to that, because that's one issue that I'm a little.
Let me jump in on that one. Okay. I think it is important to know that the FDA does clear products that are non-prescription products also. So they are very active in that space. So just because you have a product that's a digital therapeutic, by how we define it and talk about it, that is considered as a medical device by FDA, there are numerous products that are digital therapeutic products cleared by the FDA that are non-prescription also. So there is an entire pathway that doesn't require just a prescription pathway. There are many though that do, and
what's the difference between that? Is the non-prescription one just based on safety? I mean, not that those products shouldn't do the clinical trial and show they're effective as well, because they shouldn't be used if they're not. But what's the difference in your mind between those two?
You know, it's a great question. I think when you're looking at it, a company will come to the FDA initially. My understanding is, and I have not actually submitted a process or a pre-sub to an FDA at this point personally, but my understanding is you actually identify right off the bat saying, we recognize that we're a medical device. We are going to go down the non-prescription route and then, or the prescription route. And then you have a discussion around the types of trials and the types of outcomes necessary and what that's going to look like during your pre-sub meeting. And then you progress through the process. So I really do believe companies have a good amount of say in what market access they're going toward, given the fact that some of these will be used by employer groups, some of them will be used by health system groups, some will be used by different PBMs or different entities of that nature. So I think all that to say, every digital therapeutic is going to be addressing a different patient population in a different setting with a different level of rigor, specificity, or whatever the case is for their disease state. So not all digital therapeutics should be prescription only. FDA does clear products that are non-prescription also. So I think that's just one distinction in there, that I don't think it's a matter of quality per se. I think as we're trying within the DTA, our alliance is being part of a digital therapeutic means you have to have quality management system, have to have clinical trial results, have to have all these extra ongoing notions about our 10 principles. So I think there is...
And they're great, by the way, and they should also be applied to non-digital stuff in the rest of healthcare, which they haven't been enough, but keep going.
Yeah, no, so it's not my jurisdiction precisely, and hence why I'm really focused on that area. But I think that is just one point to bring up, though, in terms of you can have a medical device that is a non-prescription product.
Okay, so let's go on the ones that are heading down the path, and a lot of people have headed down this path of saying, a lot of companies are saying, okay, we built this digital therapeutic, and now we want it to be prescribed, and now we want it to be reimbursed, kind of like a prescribed drug or a prescribed medical device. So I think if I was to my criticism is not so much that, the FDA, and the FDA has said that some of these devices have to be like that. And I think if you're, shining light in somebody's eyes and telling them you're going to cure Alzheimer's or whatever, I understand that has to be shown to be safe. You can't just willingly say this thing should be a consumer device. That I grant you. But if you go down the path that more and more of these things have to be prescribed by a doctor, you're starting to move that into a medical model, which looks like the current drug company medical model. And if I had one sort of basic underlying criticism of what's happening in digital therapeutics, it's that the goal should be, in my mind, to take these new technologies, which hopefully are more effective and safer in general than molecule interventions, put them in the appropriate ecosystem of other care, coaching, support that we've talked about, but basically scale them as much as possible and also make the whole thing cheaper. And it seems to me that many of the companies in your alliance are getting on the path of saying, if we can get this prescribed like a drug, reimbursed like a drug by the PBMs and the rest of it, our goal is to charge for this thing like a drug. And my goal is I would like drugs to be cheaper, not digital therapeutics to be more expensive. And I think when we were in Berlin, there was a lot of conversation about the European companies building digital therapeutics. So how do we get to the US? Because we know we can charge more money for our drugs there, and therefore we can charge more money for our digital therapeutics. Am I being unfair, or is this actually the philosophy of many of your members?
I think it's slightly unfair, but these also are the conversations.
I'm used to being very unfair, by the way, so slightly unfair is good.
I mean, I'm not going to say so I think when you're looking at it, it's still a notion of who's your target audience that you're aiming for. So by and large, digital therapeutics are not direct-to-consumer products. You could have a product that is a non-prescription, as we talked about, products that are prescription, but by and large, we don't see a lot of DTX products that are over-the-counter in the traditional way of just go ahead, download the app and use it, and just the patient has that decision, because again, we're looking at products that are for the right patient at the right time, for the right condition, the right severity of disease state, so forth. So there's generally some form of an authorization that goes into play here. I think where maybe our views are just a little different on this one, but I think when you're looking at who's authorizing that, if you're going to fit into a healthcare system, you're going to have to meet some of the requirements that they have to actually deliver therapies. So how do they get their therapies into an electronic health record? What's the process for a P&T committee, a pharmacy and therapeutics review in the United States? What's an HTA evaluation like in Europe? There are notions where you have to fit into some of the currently existing structures to actually fit into those models, to actually integrate into a patient's life, depending on the type of indication and so forth you're looking at there. So I think that is some of the component too. It's not necessarily the discussion from my side I haven't heard people saying, aha, here's how we're going to do it and do like this evil laugh behind it. It's much more of how do we actually address the patient needs we're needing to address? How do we actually serve the individuals who are going to be the ones to authorize this? How do we get this integrated into workflows? And I think it's even Eddie from Achille has said, disrupt without interrupting. So some notion of that idea around sometimes, yes, you can break all the rules. And I would love to see that happen if you can create a new model and deliver therapies to patients in a scalable way that maybe doesn't need all these systems. That'd be fascinating to see. But by and large, the systems exist and we have to work to some degree within some of those systems. And that I think is a component of what we're seeing a lot of is how do we actually work with the payer entities? How do we work with P&T committees? How do we actually get these processed and adjudicated and claims done and all these things that it's a part of therapy. So that is, I think, a balance. Where's the innovation versus how do we fit within the system, and where along the spectrum do different companies have to fall, or can they break the rules, and will that work? And I think that's a lot of the discussion that we're seeing.
I mean, my question would be, and you brought up Achille, which is interesting because I happen to have a kid who's not an Achille user, but could be an Achille user. But she is a user or a patient. You know, she's been to therapy, and which is expensive, and she is on medication, which now it's generic. By the way, it's pretty bloody expensive medication for being generic. But it's like a $40-50 a month medication. But when Achilles come to market with their product, they're talking about $150 a month. Which is more like the price of you can argue what it's like closer to the price of, but it's closer to the price of, a new online prescription, branded prescription drug that's on patent rather than a generic, which should be a lot cheaper. And it just seems to me that it's a video game, right? We know that I know there's a ton of clinical research and scientific and great stuff behind it, and it's cost them a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, we know that you can make video games to a hell of a lot cheaper than you can make drugs because you're making video games that apply to millions of people, and and you spread the cost a lot. So there's a lot of R&D in a standard video game that made by Epic or made by when they made Fortnite or they make whatever they get those games. But you spread it across a larger number of people. My sense should be that I would hope that we can that despite all the things you mentioned, all the things that they have to deal with current efficacy and dealing with the current setup of the healthcare system as it is, in the end, if there are, for instance, millions of kids with ADHD who are untreated out there, and there are, or millions of people with depression who could use, a CBT from someone like a Happify or what have you, my goal is that should become cheaper and more general and more widespread. And maybe it's not being done in a malicious or an egregious way, but it does seem to me that heading down that we want to be like a drug path tends us to make us look more like drugs in America, which are expensive, and we're looking for somebody, an employer or the government, to pay for them, rather than can we make something that could be spread cheaply and have the benefit of all these great technology we're developing.
So I think the only thing I'm going to answer on that one, just because it's not my area of expertise either to be going into all the pricing, so I don't want to misrepresent. But I think it is important to just acknowledge that we're still early in the industry and there's still a lot to be figured out. So what does value-based contracting actually look like? What does outcomes-based contracting really look like? What are all these different pricing mechanisms that different groups can use, and how is that going to evolve? We're going to see a lot of evolution because payers right now are still looking at how do we even evaluate them? What kind of clinical evidence we're looking for? What are the main notions of what needs to be there before we even move forward? Much less, I don't think we've hit that perfect state yet where everyone knows, aha, this is exactly how we're going to go about and approach this, because now we understand this all and we understand the ecosystem. I think it's the cool part of creating a new industry, but we are creating a new industry here. So that notion is still new to the different payer decision maker entities. And that is where I think there's still going to be a lot of development, growth, and learnings along the way that I don't think we have had all the way yet. So all that to say, I can't speak for anyone who's outside of the group of companies I work with. I haven't seen malicious intent by any of them. I've only seen where they're really trying, and they're really trying to make this work. That said, I think we all know that together we need to figure out the systems that will work from a value access reimbursement component. And there's a lot to be discovered there yet and developed.
Yeah, and I'd quote our friend Brian Dellman on this, who I forget who it was. He wrote in one of his things about, he compared the pricing of one company had basically had a consumer product, shut it down, and then made it into a product aimed going through the prescription route, and the price was 10 times what it had been as a consumer product. And I wrote to him and said, "This is the problem." And he tweeted, I think I tweeted, and he tweeted back and said, "Doesn't mean they're actually going to get the price that they're looking for." And I think, as you said, a lot of this is to be sorted out. My hope is that, the companies working in the Digital Therapeutics Alliance and many others, who are trying to figure out how do we use this new set of technology to really move healthcare ahead, improve the experience of patients and doctors and clinicians, improve outcomes, and use these new tools. And as I said, I'm a bit of a user in some of my cases with some of my family of these. And I can see a lot of ways that we could get, we could get a lot better. It's just a question, I think, that I would hope the goal is to spread this as widely as possible, because in general, not just for drugs, in healthcare in America, we charge too much money and we don't get the sort of access that I think that we need to as many of the people who could use it. I'm hopeful, I've been hopeful for 25 years, so I'm not sure it's ever going to really work, that the new wave of technology, whether you call it, go back to all of our definitions, digital medicine, digital health, health 2.0, M health, whatever you want to call it, that those are that this will enable us to distribute the ability to have better health and better health experiences to everybody more easily at a lower cost. That's my, fingers crossed mode. I'm sure we can agree on that.
No, totally. I think there's a lot of truth there. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. And actually, Brian would be the perfect person. So let's bring him to that conversation. But I think we've actually seen some degree of parity even between what's taking place in Germany right now and what's taking place in some of the aspects of the United States. So that'll be interesting to see more of the European pricing models develop. And then ideally, yes, for underserved areas that have never had access to clinical care before, in parts of the world that haven't always had access to these, like cell phones are fairly ubiquitous. There's a lot of them out there. How can we actually start to deliver therapies? My initial background has been in global health. So those notions to me are really fascinating. And I look forward to developing more of that, whether it's WHO's engagement, whether it's the World Bank's engagement, whether it's other foundations out there. So I think there's a lot to be had here, because the notion, again, that we could actually deliver high quality therapy to patients across the world, delivered in an accessible way in, again, their own language and culture. That is a component. I always say, like, a atorvastatin doesn't have to speak Spanish, but if you're using this in a Spanish-speaking population, you need to have it in Spanish. But there's a lot, once you can get beyond some of those notions around data storage and so forth, the scalability notion of what digital therapies and digital therapeutics can do is really cool to think about. Let's
leave us agreeing, which we may not have thought we were going to do. I've been speaking with Megan Coda. She's the executive director of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. And Megan, thanks for your time. We look forward to continuing the conversation, but I think that was pretty interesting.
Nice to talk with you. Thanks so much.